Metroid Prime is a game that thrives on the rapid reward for exploration and a willingness to inspect one's surroundings. Looking around will yield mass amounts of information, predominantly through the scan visor, which provides everything from lore to world building to information on how to defeat enemies, to foreshadowing on future encounters just as much as past events. The gaining of this information will often coincide with upgrades in the form of missile expansions and energy tanks, as well as others that are going to be held for the mechanics section for spoiler reasons. The way the game introduces elements of its gameplay are done in such a way as to progressively prepare the player for what is coming next, an amazing example of which being the War Wasps. The first time the player encounters them in the Chozo Ruins, the hives are inactive. They're scannable, but don't spawn anything yet, meaning the player can learn in a risk-free environment. Next, there will be multiple hives, but they'll only spawn a couple at a time, creating an easy encounter for you to learn practically. Next, the hives will spawn several war wasps and behave as they will for the rest of the game, both introducing the difficulty to be expected, while also making it apparent that the further in you explore, the more wasps you're encountering. All of this peaking once Samus reaches the hive totem, and the wasps become a swarm-style boss fight. The game does this throughout the entire experience. First the dead parasites, then the living parasites, then the dead parasite queen, then the alive parasite queen. The first space pirate you find is dying, immobile, and barely able to shoot back. Then they're limping toward you slowly, then they're fully active, then they start getting specialized, then they turn into bosses. This both ensures that players are given plenty of time to acclimate to new challenges, as well as introducing a sense of scale and escalation to those challenges over time. Where the game falls off hard, however, is in the endgame, where, without spoiling precisely how or why, the game becomes a collectathon. As the world of the game expands, the longer it generally takes to traverse. There is no form of fast travel at any point, and while shortcuts are present, something that I'm going to touch on more in level design, they can only do so much in the face of needing to go to the opposite end of the world from where you are to get what you need, and this cannot be circumvented in any meaningful way. Even if you know where all of the collectibles are in advance, some of them require that you have the 2 final upgrades in the game to obtain them, which is to say that even if you went through all of the trouble of finding, scanning, and reading everything which tells you where the collectibles are hidden, there is no way for you to get every single one of them as you progress the game naturally. You have to go back no matter what. It's a weirdly tragic turn, as a game with some of the best early game pacing in anything eventually slows to the point of simply becoming a chore to beat. Metroid Prime takes place almost entirely on the planet of Talon 4 and is split into 5 main areas connected through various elevators: the Talon Overworld, the Chozo Ruins, Magmoor Caverns, Phendrana Drifts, and the Phazon Mines, each of which becoming more than what they initially appear. By the nature of how Metroidvania design works, the game has the player explore each area at least twice. Most often, the first time arriving in a new area will be met with finding a map station, seeing the extent of what the area has to offer, and exploring it until a major upgrade is found, which in turn will allow the player to explore the next area. However, as the game progresses, the player will unlock more and more until they backtrack to an area that they explored previously, and find that nearly every area in the game is twice the size of what they had previously experienced. The levels are also built in such a way as to enable players to traverse them more quickly the further into the game that they progressed. Many areas of Magmoor will have damaging obstacles or platforming rooms covered in lava and enemies, all of which have to be handled with care initially, but later can be entirely overcome or avoided based upon how powerful the player's arsenal of weapons and tools has become. An incredibly simple example of this kind of level design at play is in the first major room of the Chozo Ruins, a place that the player will have over time become very well acquainted with. There's a ledge that seems mostly pointless and simply a part of the environment, but once the player unlocks the ability to double jump, this ledge now serves as a shortcut which eliminates the need to run around the back half of the room in order to explore the upper levels. And beyond the levels, the world organically evolves based on how far the player has progressed. The easiest example of this being the enemies and the Phendrana Drifts. The moment the player ventures deeper in, they will encounter a baby Sheegoth. Later, however, they will have to defeat a fully grown Sheegoth adult, and from then on, the adults begin appearing more and more frequently, and the baby Sheegoths can be encountered in earlier areas that they didn't used to be. In the same manner, several areas will be filled with local fauna, before eventually being entirely snuffed out as space pirate patrols kill them all and take their place, with one interesting exception. The frigate Orpheon, which serves as the tutorial area of the game, crash lands on the Talon 4 once the tutorial boss is defeated. As with Phendrana, the space pirates will destroy any wildlife they find and replace them as enemies, but unlike in Phendrana, the space pirates will eventually be driven out from their own wreckage by a large number of aquatic predators, showing the space pirates that, while this was once their ship, it's not on their planet. Metroid Prime Remastered had no meaningful bugs or glitches for the entirety of my playthrough, not even so much as a frame drop during a boss fight or cutscene. The worst things that I can point out are some minor issues with two things: hit detection and aim assist. Some objects in the environment, as well as many enemy turrets found throughout the game, have either misplaced or oddly small amounts of geometry that can be interacted with by the player's shots. The main issue is with the enemy turrets, as it appears that only part of the turret actually exists, and it's the box that attaches to the surface that it hangs from. The other half of the entire turret's model doesn't appear to have any hurt box whatsoever, which can lead to some frustration after missing several missiles. However, this problem instantly is done away with once the player simply locks on, ensuring that the shots always land. The more significant of the two is the aim assist issue, with the aim assist having nothing to do with the reticle, and more accurately, having any shot that gets fired be pulled toward where an enemy was when it was fired, giving every projectile a minor amount of tracking, even if the player isn't locked on or the projectile doesn't specialize in tracking. However, this also means that the player can't very well aim near Metroids as they rhythmically bob back and forth. Even if they try to aim ahead of the Metroid to catch it, the shot will always be pulled back to where the Metroid was when the shot was initially fired, making it miss. But ultimately, this is still a minor issue, because the moment the player gets closer and plays more aggressively, this problem with aim assist completely disappears. Hey, you've already watched more than most people, so please subscribe, and of course, beware bird magic and spoilers from this point forward. Metroid Prime's story is unique in that it is told almost entirely through world building and foreshadowing. The gameplay and progression alone present an incredibly simple story that is less narrative and more a vehicle for Metroidvania things to happen. Samus' response to a distress signal from an unknown vessel revealed to be a space pirate ship, a boss fight happens, Meta Ridley is revealed, and both he and Samus flee the crashing vessel to Talon 4, the planet that they were in orbit over. But, of course, not before Samus takes a massive impact that breaks most of her suit. The rest of the game is simply regaining all of her gear, stopping the space pirates from being alive, killing every Metroid she sees, and eventually destroying the source of the corruption from within the planet that the space pirates were using. Like I said, much less of a story and much more of a series of events for gameplay to happen around, but the moment you take a step back and look around, the world unfolds before you. Aboard the pirate frigate Orpheon, Samus encounters shipping containers holding a substance called Phazon. It has radioactive and mutagenic properties, and is the reason for the massive transformations of the Parasite Queens, which the pirates had planned to use as bioweapons. And, unsurprisingly, for a vessel which apparently had managed to flee the planet Zebes while Samus was destroying their facilities in the original Metroid game, they also managed to smuggle a handful of Metroids for reproduction and experimentation. The moment that she finds a container being salvaged by the two flying pirates, she'll find that the Phazon will eat through her armor like lava if touched. And while fighting through the pirate labs, she'll discover writings of Project Helix, another Phazon mutation project, among many others wherein the space pirates have been using themselves as test subjects. As it not only appears that the substance may hold very strong potential for bioweapons, but also for the acceleration of pirate evolution. However, their progress into the impact crater where most of the Phazon is located was halted by a mysterious barrier. Enter the Chozo, the bird-like race of religious and borderline technomagic people who took in Samus after she was orphaned by the pirates, who had evidently colonized Talon 4 long ago. In their writings, Samus learns of a great poison which fell from the sky, corrupting the land in a plague of mythical proportion. It transformed the beasts of the wilds into monsters, poisoned the very water they drank, and even stirred the once dead spirits of Chozo ancestors back into life and raged at the desecration of what was once held sacred to them. As a last resort, they pooled all of their energy and remaining resources into a temple suspended above the crater of the Great Poison, and using this temple, they enshrouded the poison in a barrier before the last of the Chozo on Talon 4 succumbed to the poison. The story of Metroid Prime, really, is that of a war between the current space pirates, desperate for an edge against both Samus and the Galactic Federation in their bid to dominate the galaxy, and the past Chozo, equally desperate to contain the plague which destroyed their people and the planet, and whose technology both keeps the pirates at bay and is wielded by Samus in the form of her power armor. The unfortunate thing is that if you're a more impatient player who generally prefers to just run through and shoot everything rather than explore, all of the details that I just mentioned will be entirely lost on you. And while the game does incentivize you to scan everything possible for the sake of completion with the extra unlocks in the main menu, the collection percentages in the pause menu, and the different endings based on how quickly you reach high levels of completion, ultimately, your playstyle will decide whether or not this game has a very in-depth narrative that you get to unravel at your own pace, or a story which doesn't exist. Metroid Prime's game mechanics and how the game is designed around them revolve almost entirely around the 4 different beam upgrades that the player can unlock. These are the Power Beam, the Wave Beam, the Ice Beam, and the Plasma Beam, each of which having different use cases, but they do unfortunately begin to overlap by the end game. But before I break those down, let's address everything else very quickly. Samus unlocks the usual Varia and Gravity suits, which do the same thing that they always done, increasing resistance to dangerous environments and allowing traversal through water respectively. And one more suit obtained through the 3rd to last boss, which grants a benefit against only the final boss, and prevents damage from phase-on exposure, which is relevant for one singular hallway after you get it, and is practically retconned out of usefulness while inside the impact crater. The Morph Ball allows Samus to traverse tight spaces, save herself from Metroids that attach themselves to her face, slowly climb on magnetic rail surfaces using the Spider Ball upgrade, and most importantly, the Boost Ball, which becomes by far the fastest traversal option in the game, provided that the terrain is flat enough for you to take advantage of it. Lastly, and most simply, the Grapple Beam and the Space Jump. The Grapple Beam lets you Spider-Man off of very specific points in the environment, and the Space Jump lets you double jump. Although, annoyingly, it only allows you to double jump if you use the first jump, and you don't get the double jump in the air otherwise. Now onto the weapons. The Power Beam is the fastest firing but weakest beam, and likely the one that you're going to be using the least. Although what saves it is the application of beam combos. Beam combos are what happens when a beam is charged and a missile is fired through it. And by charging the Power Beam and using a missile, you get the Super Missile, which will serve as the strongest raw damage dealer for most of the game until the player unlocks the Plasma Beam. It is also the only beam combo that is a required unlock to beat the game, so the remaining ones I will allow you to discover for yourself. The Power Beam also has one very specific property, which is that apparently it uses an unnatural form of energy, which can therefore damage the raised Chozo ghosts. The Wave Beam is slightly higher in damage and has a slower firing rate than the Power Beam, but it uniquely has a homing property on all shots fired while locked on, and its Charge Beam can electrocute and stun most enemies. It also has the ability to power on any hidden electrical conduits. The Ice Beam is the slowest firing but second highest damage beam, and has the unique ability to freeze enemies with its Charge Shot. This provides one of the most cost-efficient ways of effectively two-shotting most enemies, as they will shatter after being frozen and then shot with a single missile, which saves a lot over the 5-round cost of using a Super Missile. It can also freeze the Flame Jets and Magmor, making traversal much more bearably quick in the mid-game. And lastly, the Plasma Beam is busted. It fires just as fast, if not faster, than the Wave Beam, but deals nearly as much damage with a Charge Shot as a Super Missile. The beam is also so strong that it destroys enemies that were previously only vulnerable to missiles, and its special property is that it has the ability to melt ice, permafrost, and substances that otherwise function as supercoolants. As you progress, the game will introduce many enemies that are weak to only one type of beam, with the best example being the advanced forms of Pirate Troopers, which serve as a direct and rapid response to Samus being observed using her various beam weapons in their facilities. The final major part that needs to be mentioned are the 4 different visors that Samus can choose to equip. Combat is the default visor that provides all the necessary status information that you can have, as well as providing the clearest line of sight plus a radar for enemies. The Scan visor allows the player to scan elements of the environment for anything ranging from random tidbits of lore to critical combat strategies and boss fights. The Thermal visor tracks the heat signature of objects and creatures in the environment, as well as any electrical circuits and door shields can be seen through walls, and allowing players to see invisible organic enemies at the cost of rendering mechanical or frozen enemies completely invisible. And lastly, the X-ray visor allows the player to see through any terrain that's damaged or any terrain that is phased out of the visible spectrum of light, as well as highlighting any weaknesses or presences of enemies that could be invisible to any other form of imaging. Naturally, with this game being a remaster, a major question is going to be, does the game look and sound better than the original? The answer being a near resounding yes. Let me explain. In terms of visuals, the game has many upgrades that improve over the original. Enemies are retextured, if not sometimes outright remodeled, to look more detailed than ever. Look no further than the Sheegoth for how much better enemies can look over the original. VFX for the charge beams also look phenomenal. The light of the energy being manufactured creeping through the segments of the power beam configuration, the arm cannon coursing with lightning as you charge the wave beam, your entire arm freezing solid when you charge the ice beam, and the sparks of fire seemingly being drawn to the front of the gun from the exposed magma being vented in the back of the plasma beam. However, for some reason, the decision was made to remove all of the Chozo symbols from any scannable objects and replace them all with featureless rounded squares. This is despite the fact that Samus's armor is Chozo in origin, and having the symbols there made perfect sense, and in future games, the symbols would actually change to reflect what type of object is being scanned. But in the remaster of Prime, it seems they almost regressed it back to having less detail than the original for some reason in this regard. And on that note, the blood effects of the dying pirates still look over 20 years old despite the models for the pirates having themselves been improved. The audio design, on the other hand, is phenomenal. Every enemy type, from the wasps, to the pirates, to the Sheegoths, to even the most minor of enemies, sound unique from one another. The Chozo ghosts not only have their own unique sound set, but also a panic-inducing theme that begins playing anytime you're locked into a room with them. Each area has a theme that's very distinct and sets it apart from the rest, many of which have been playing in the background of this review, and while the following statement is more subjective than most of what I like to allow before the opinion segment, I would argue that Metroid has the most iconic and memorable sound effects set, only in contest with Legend of Zelda. I was very surprised by Metroid Prime Remastered in both a lot of good and not so good ways, but not necessarily in anything having to do with the fact that it's a remaster. I mean, yeah, the scan icon thing was dumb and annoying. I have no idea why they did that. I was really hoping they would kind of update it so it'd be more like Prime Hunters Onward, you know, kind of modernize it up to the sequels. But that aside, I was in a really weird position where when I started, I was just geeking out, right? I even feel bad about my first hour video because I never had any reactions or anything that was funny other than just, oh, hey, that thing is so good. Let me explain to you why that's done super well and it stands out to me. Like, I ended my first couple recording sessions thinking, oh gosh, I'm gonna have too many games that are gonna be rated really highly in a row. The tier list is gonna end up just like last year where everything's in A tier. But then I kept playing and I kept finding that I went from having almost exclusively good things to say to having mostly bad things to say. And I think that really does come down to a more psychological thing and a conditioning thing. But before we move on, I'll say that my opinion score is probably an 8 out of 10. I still really enjoy the game. I'll still go back and play it. I'm probably gonna 100% it just for fun. But I mean, my recommendation's wavering a bit, I'll admit. When you're early in the game, you're constantly discovering new things, and every time you unlock something, you're rewarded immediately, not only with what you unlocked, but also for all of the exploration that you did beforehand to get there. And that dopamine drip is constant and just keeps going and going and going. But as the world gets bigger, the time that it takes for you to get that reward drip takes longer and longer and longer between them, to the point where it almost doesn't feel like a reward anymore, and the final collectathon almost just feels kind of spiteful. It's like they misunderstood what makes Metroidvania exciting and interesting, because the backtracking and exploring of areas that you've already been through isn't fun on principle. It's fun because it functions as your reward for progressing and becoming more powerful, and the world expands the more powerful you get. When that instead then becomes, okay, you're as powerful as you're gonna get, now it's time to go and run back through everywhere you've already been through because you gotta get a bunch of necessary items you didn't know were there, it's just dumb, and it feels like a waste of time. It's weird because this game starts at a 10 out of 10, and then it just slowly goes downhill from there. But enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? So a bit of a weird thing, I still really like the game, but I sort of struggle to recommend it to you if you don't know anything about it ahead of time. Even knowing what was coming and doing some stuff in advance, the game still felt like a slog sometimes to me in the back end. But either way, I will see you, yes you, next time.